You recall my first lecture on the first night we were here, I offered a very broad survey of almost 1,000 years, and then I focused on 3 rabbis in the early modern period, and today I'm going to focus on one rabbi alone. So we go from the universal to the particular, and I think that's much easier to grasp. But I do want to say one thing before I start. I would like, in the most idyllic terms, to think that if you are interested in this subject, you would like to pursue it a little bit more deeply than my 3 lectures. And therefore, I want to be very careful about this. I'm not selling any books, but I want to encourage you to see the fuller statement of what I have done over the past 25 years in this subject. I'm not going to mention all my books. I just want to mention 2. One that I think generally covers the subject, and one of the subject for today's lecture, if you're interested. And I also have a cheap way of doing it, so I'll just explain that in a second. First of all, the titles of the books. One is called Jewish Thought and Scientific Discovery in Early Modern Europe. It was originally published by Yale, and then Wayne State Press put out a paperback edition with a very interesting introduction by Moshe Idel, the Kabbalah scholar. So if you're interested in the larger subject and to see the wide scope, that would probably be the book. The subject today comes from a book I just published about 1.5 years ago. I think the title is something like a best-selling Hebrew book of the modern era, and you'll see why it is a bestseller. It was published by University of Washington Press in 2014. And that is specifically the treatment of this subject this evening, as I said. A cheap way of doing it is to go to Google Books if you've never used Google Books before. They give you a large selections from each of the books without having to pay. It's very irritating because you get to it in the middle of a chapter and all of a sudden they'll cut you off because they want to sell the book. But you don't have to do that. You can just read those passages that they give you. And that would be, Diego from my perspective. So at least take a look at it and see it's there. Obviously I can do a much better job that way than I can in these oral presentations. But I hope I have at least whetted your appetite and to see that this is a subject not only worthy of Jewish study, but Reform Jewish study as well. As I preface my remarks in our first evening, I do offer you a kind of Reform Jewish historiography. And my interest in this inner and outer world is really what helps define our Jewish identity. Okay, now what I want to do is to talk about my love affair with a book. I've known about this book for a real long time, but I never thought worthy that I could actually tackle it. I am by trade, by profession, an early modern cultural historian, and much of my work revolved around Italy and then later on England. But Eastern Europe, of course, was more distant from the world that I inhabit as an historian. Indeed, this book, while published in 1797, the first edition of the book, the many, many editions of the book which you'll hear about run through the 19th and 20th century. So in many respects, it is a modern work, and as an early modern historian, we usually don't cross the line and write about something that we know less about. But as I got older, what the hell, I've got tenure, nobody's going to take my job away. Why can't I say whatever I want about, do whatever I want? So in the end, in a series of lectures I gave originally in Seattle, the University of Washington, that's why the Washington Press published the book, I worked out a study of this work. And I think a lot of the themes that we have been speaking about up to now are going to come out again in this book. In many respects, it's a belated expression of developments that emerged earlier, but in many respects, it is also a modern book and a work for our time. And the most important thing that I want to tell you about right now, and I'll come back to at the end, is that this book was read by all kinds of Jews. And if I wasn't convinced, I went on a chat line called Sichot Haredim, And there they're discussing this book called Sefer Habrit. You know, that's their science, I mean, for the 21st century. I couldn't believe that I was reading, you know, living Jews with Pinhas and are studying this book and so on. And I realized the wide range of interest. There were over 40 editions of this book. There were 5 editions in Ladino. There were 3 editions in Yiddish. It has not been translated into English. But nevertheless, it was a book that was held in a library almost as a Sefer Kodesh. It was a book that offered Jews the opportunity to explore the natural world from a traditionally Jewish perspective. And therefore, I really wanted to understand this as a kind of strategy, as a kind of part of the process by which Jews enter the modern world. So Sefer Habrit is the story of one book and one author, but it is also the story of a journey of traditional Jews especially into the modern world, and particularly into the world of science and nature. So my presentation is more or less 4 parts, 4 acts, so to speak. I want to talk about the earlier context of this book in chapter 1, or in Act 1. In Act 2, I want to actually speak about the text itself and tell you what's in it just a little bit. And then I want to talk about one particular text which deals with ethics and morality. And then finally, I want to come to talking about the impact of this book and its legacy. I must tell you that in the last 2 months, a new edition of Sefer Habrit has appeared. I purchased it. I haven't digested it yet. It is much more beautiful type with all kinds of notes written by a Haredi author who tries to explain all the scientific terms. I think the text that I've given you, which is the text, as you will see, of the discovery of smallpox by Edward Jenner, is from the new edition, so that you can see it's printed very beautifully and so on, and you can acquire it if you can find some traditional bookstore and so on. But there are really lots of editions of this book. In Warsaw alone in the 19th century, there were 11 editions of this book. So it was read primarily by Eastern European Jews, by the bulk of that traditional society in the 19th century. So although it may be a remote work to our own ears, it was indeed a book that was part and parcel of the traditional Jewish library in the past several centuries, and I'll come back to that at the end. My author is Pinhas Hurwitz. You can see over there, excuse that, that's a different title, but it's basically the same thing. I can't even see that far, but that's the edition of Brooklyn 1990. The cover, it's made to look with its leather like a Sefer Kodesh, which I think is very typical. And I think that's the first page of the first edition of the book. Oh, I can see it better here, I'm sorry. And let me just show you 1 or 2 more things. No, I'm going to skip that. But here's the title page from the first edition of In Brno, in Czechoslovakia, 1797, and then the second edition, Vilna, 1817. You can see that there is no table of contents, but the title page is a kind of table of contents telling you what's in it. I don't know if that would sell a book these days. That's pretty long to try to read, and I don't know if you can even read a word of it from here. But at least you can see. I'm sorry I don't have the Sefer in my hand. I'd like sometimes to teach with it, but it was too heavy on the plane. And in any case, there are so many different editions of the book. But these are 2, and you will hear a little later on, the second edition is very different than the first, because the first edition was pirated. And the author was really incensed, so he decided to write a much more expanded edition, which from Vilna on in 1817 came out in even longer form than the earlier edition. Pinhas Hurwitz is the author of the book. He lived from 1765 to 1821. He was born in Vilna. He was a European traveler who clearly was a transnational and transcultural Jew, in the sense that he left Eastern Europe. And he went to places like Budapest, Lemberg, Frankfurt de Oder, Galicia in Eastern Europe, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, London, Prague, and he dies then finally in Krakow. So he makes this long journey from the east all the way to the west, ends up even in England and London, then comes back through the South, and then finally makes his way back to Krakow. So we're speaking here about a transcontinental Jew, and I think that's very important. We could define him as an Eastern European Jew. He was indeed a traditional Jew. He was a Jew with Kabbalistic interests. This, as you will hear, is about Kabbalah and science. But clearly, he is more than that, because he travels around, and he listens, and he's actively engaged in the world around him. Moreover, he's doing one very important thing, which also defines him as a modern Jew, and that is he is selling books. He's a mocher sparim. And he's aware of the book market, and he's aware of the power of the printed page. And indeed, he is a bestseller. He tried to publish a whole series of books after this, including a commentary on a Kabbalistic work. There was one edition of the work that was published after his death. Most of his other works remain in manuscript, and they are really quite insignificant. And many of his works, which he lists the titles of, we don't have extant. So this was a one, like many academics, they made it on one book, and then they coasted after they got tenure, and that's exactly what he did. That's a little bit about Pinhas Hurwitz, but now let me turn to my 4 acts, so you'll know where I'm going, and when you get to the 3rd and 4th, you know that I'm almost finished and you'll be happy. First of all, the context of this book. I referred to it a little bit already, and I recall I had to run through those passages very quickly on Thursday evening, but you recall when we read Halevi and Nachmanides, we were talking about this esoteric science called a science of ruchaniut, of ruach, ruchani, and so on. I want you to remember that context. In other words, it is rather unusual to think of the idea that Kabbalists, students of Jewish mysticism, were also engaged in the natural world and science, but indeed we have a long history of this. Ostensibly, it is right here in front of us, because when you open up the introduction to this work, he tells us that he is not writing a book of science, but he is writing a commentary on a Kabbalistic work of the 16th century by Chaim Vital. All of you know who Chaim Vital was, the great prophet and figure of Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century, the one who left us Lurianic writings because Luria hardly wrote a thing. His Eitz Chaim is a classic work. He was also, however, a doctor. I don't know if you knew that, and he wrote a work on refuot, on medicine. So already in the figure of Chaim Vital, we have this coagination of science and Kabbalah. But Pinhas Hurwitz is going to write a commentary on a book Chaim Vital wrote. And the work is a remarkable book called Sha'arei Kedusha. It's definitely a work that NAORRR could study. It's about how to imbibe the Ruach HaKodesh, to speak with God. Wouldn't that be great to actually just read this work and just take off to the heavens? It's not even for old people. I mean, it's for young people too. Anytime you want to do it. And what's beautiful about Sha'arei Kedusha, how to imbibe the Ruach HaKodesh, in other words, Nevuah, without living in the Eretz HaKodesh, without living in Israel, and without living in the biblical period, when, of course, all the prophets arose. Sha'arei Kedusha was a popular Kabbalistic word, part of the Lurianic explosion of the 16th and 17th century, many editions of the work, and it basically is part and parcel of this larger literature of Kabbalistic Musar. Many works appeared, written by Kabbalists during this period of time, that focus on morality and ethics. Perhaps the most famous is Ramchal's Mesilat Yesharim. I'm sure some of you know it. I own it in my library when I was, when Daniel Jeremy Silverzal was alive. I went out many times to Cleveland to speak in the synagogue, and when he was sick, I did Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur right before he died. It was very sad, a bitter experience, but very moving. And he took me several times into his library of his father, and gave me a copy of Mesilat Yesharim, this moralistic text, very much like Sha'arei Kedusha, written by the Ramchal, Rabbi Moses Chaim Lutzato, from the library of Abba Hillel Silver. So I own that book, and it's very interesting that Abba Hillel Silver, one of our great Reform luminaries, was reading Kabbalistic Musar in Cleveland, Ohio, in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is supposedly a commentary. Why is he writing a commentary? Because, according to Pinhas Hurwitz, he's missing one thing. He's talking about Musar, he's talking about how the Aliyat Neshama is going to take place and so on. But finally, there's something missing. In order to understand one's spirituality, one needs to know the natural world. And although it's clear that this was important to Vital, Pinhas Hurwitz wants to fill in the blanks that were left out of the original version. So what we have here is a work which in its present form is about 600-700 pages. It's divided into two parts. The first part gives us a kind of inventory of 18th century science. Scientific discoveries galore, including, as you will see in that text, the Jenner vaccine, but many other things. What do you call it? Things that go down to the sea. What's the word? Yeah, not a submarine, but a diving bells, and wind machines, and all kinds of incredible things that are going on in the world of discovery in the 18th century. He loves to describe in this book and then say, how wonderful is your works, O Lord. I mean, it is passionately, it helps us understand the world, the contingency of human beings, and the supreme majesty of God, who constantly mechadesh b'chol yom maseh bereshit. So that clearly is the sentiment of this work. In the second half of the book, then, there's a transformation. It changes to discussing Kabbalistic Musar and leading us slowly but surely until we enter a room, put on white, cleanse ourselves, and prepare to imbibe the Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, I guess I should read that last part with you and we can all ascend before the end of this conference into something else. But you can do that on your own, or maybe the next conference, whatever. In any case, that's the way the book is structured. But what's interesting here, it's really an encyclopedia of the sciences plus all of this Kabbalistic stuff. But what's interesting is that it is not an encyclopedia as we would know it, as I described Lampronte's encyclopedia, with A, B, C, D, and so on. In fact, we have instructions on how to publish this work. Again, this guy's a bookseller. He knows how to ingratiate himself into a larger community of rich virim who will buy his book. But he also is very passionate about how it should be published. I don't want any break between part 1 and part 2. They are all connected, he says. I don't want a person to just read one chapter and not the second chapter. In other words, every last sentence of a chapter leads into the second chapter. It is, rather than a modern encyclopedia, more like a medieval encyclopedia. That is a spiritual journey, starting from below and moving up and up until reaching this crescendo, reaching this ultimate vision of God at the end. But clearly, to plant one's feet on the ground, one needs to know science. And therefore, the first part of the book is extraordinarily rich in science. We have a long list of texts from the Renaissance period that deal with this wonderful fusion of science and Kabbalah. Already in the 1980s, I wrote a work called Kabbalah, Magic and Science about a character named Avram Yagel, in which I took a physician who was deeply ingrained in Kabbalah and tried to examine him in the light of the origins of science. In the 1960s, a very important book appeared in the historiography of science that shook up the whole history of science field. It was written by a woman named Frances Yates, Dame Frances Yates, who lived in London, and she argued for what she called the Hermetic origins of modern science. Hermetism, of course, is part of this cultural matrix of the ancient world, a discovery of texts from an Egyptian priest named Hermes, a spiritual, magical text and so on, which were translated during the Renaissance from Greek into Latin, and then all of a sudden, a whole group of Renaissance philosophers were exploring this kind of natural magic. For her, magic and not rationality was the background and the origin of understanding modern science. From Bruno to Galileo to a whole series of other thinkers that she spoke about, all of them, and of course Newton being the most famous, all of them were reading biblical prophecy. All of them were deeply involved in the study of mysticism. All of them were, and in other words, magic was a prelude. Magic in its attempt to understand the natural world allowed, obviously there was a break between magic and science, but clearly magic prepared the ground by which individuals could reach the scientific world. So what I did was to explore Yeats's thesis in the context of Jewish writing. And I found in Yagel a prime candidate of an individual in the 16th century who was deeply involved in the study of Kabbalah, had discovered Gloria for the first time, and was trying to, but nevertheless, sitting in Italy, understood the world rationally and scientifically and empirically. And therefore, his medical research, his scientific discoveries could be linked to a Kabbalistic worldview. In other words, we explore the natural world with our own rational intellect, and then beyond that, there is a metaphysical world. Not the world of Aristotle, not the world of the philosophers, but of course the world of the Ribono Shel Olam, which can be reached through the Sefer HaZohar and through Kabbalistic texts and so on. In other words, metaphysics and physics can stand together. Maaseh Bereshit is natural philosophy. Maaseh Merkavah, of course, is the study of the esoteric wisdom of Kabbalah. And therefore, Kabbalah can be wedded together with science, and they work together. Indeed, we have a whole group of thinkers, not only in Italy, that were doing this kind of thing. Yochanan Alimano, even more famous than Yagel, but also the Maharal of Prague and a whole series of others. So the notion that Kabbalah and science could be linked together already has a long legacy before this period. And remember again, Halevi and Nachmanides as kind of medieval predecessors of this approach, of seeing a kind of spiritual view of the natural world in science. That's already part one. See how fast we're going? At least fast for me. So now part two. Let me say a few more words about Sefer Habrit. Let me see what else I have here. Hold on. Take a look at that. Can you figure out his name from that? You see, the first edition, he made a bad mistake. He tells us the story that while he was working on this work in Eastern Europe, he had a lot of problems with his eyes. And he always thought he would lose his eyes because he was working so hard at this manuscript. And therefore, he took a neder, an oath, that if he got well and he could publish this work, he would in all modesty not publish his name. So that was a stupid move in terms of copyright. But you can see from this text, and I can't read that one, let me try to read this one. So you see where the red letters are, you can see Ani, Pinhas, Eliyahu, or something like that. You can see if you spell out the red, you can figure out from the Rashi Tevot, in other words, the red letters indicate his name. So he kind of gives it to us, but not directly and so on. And indeed, of course, what happened was the second edition was pirated without his name, and he was infuriated. And thus, this led him both negatively and positively to appreciate what the book industry was all about, and what he had to do to sell books. And he had gone around the world to get 7 haskamot of rabbis. These haskamot are really very interesting, and it reveals to us already the beginning of a kind of protection copyright system for Hebrew books already in the 19th century. But in any case, he wrote his book as an autodidact. He tells us that the work was written originally in Yiddish, and he translated it into Hebrew. And he claimed he knew no other language, although he is quoting from all kinds of science of the 18th century. We do know, however, from a letter that I discovered, or that someone else discovered for me in the Prague archives, that the great Hebrew censor, Carl Fischer, a Christian Hebraeus who knew Hebrew very well and promoted the publishing of Hebrew books in Prague. Prague was one of the major centers in the early modern period of publishing books. I have a doctoral student who has been working on a dissertation on Hebrew printing in Prague. And Carl Fischer received a letter from Pinhas Hurwitz in German. So if he didn't know German, someone either wrote it for him or else he was faking it, he actually did know German. And we have that letter, and it's really a chutzpahdik letter. He says to Carl Fischer, not only accept my book and give me a haskama, and I'll show you the haskama in a second. Here it is. See? He calls it censor. You have it in German, Judeo-German. Yiddish, is that German, Yiddish? I don't know, the other is in Hebrew. But in any case, Carl Fisher, he asked Carl Fisher not only to give him, approval, but also would he take a copy of 10 books which he would sell for him in Prague. So, even the censor he asked to help him sell the books. I don't know what Fisher's answer was to him. The book is really quite interesting. This is not a Jew who, like Tuvia Kohen, went to the university and could pride himself on having a medical degree from the University of Padua. This was an autodidact. And therefore, much of the book rests on earlier Hebrew works that were written on science. And we have a long list. I give a whole course at Penn called God and Nature, which is looking at some of these sources. I don't know if any of these names will mean a great deal to you. I mentioned Yashar Candia, Joseph Del Medigo, Tuvia, of course, we've mentioned, Eliezer Ashkenazi, Israel Gans, Lippman Heller, Moses Chafetz, Azaria de Rossi. All of these names of very important figures in the early modern period are mentioned in this book. So clearly, and in addition to several works from the Haskalah, several of the Maskilim wrote scientific texts. For example, Borat Lindau, Sefer Reshit Limudim, Schnabel Levinson, Israel Samosh. Many of these guys are treated in my larger book on science. And in particular one, it's absolutely extraordinary. I wrote a book on Jewish thought in England in the 18th century. One of my characters was a guy named Jacob Hart. It's really heartening, you'll forgive the expression, to find a character in one book appear in a second book. But indeed, he turns out to be a friend of Pinhas Hurwitz, and Hurwitz traveled to London to visit Jacob Hart. So clearly they had a linkage. So I was so ahead of myself because I knew all about Jacob Hart already when I discovered his name in Pinhas Hurwitz. In addition to Jewish sources, of course, he seems to know at least a superficial knowledge of 18th century, enough to describe in the chapters in Hebrew some of the scientific discoveries of the 18th century. So we hear about Newton and Copernicus. We hear about atomism, chemical philosophy, the measurement of air and water, which are big deals in the 17th and 18th century. We hear about contemporaries like Blanchard and his helium balloon, Christian Reif, George Buffon, and others. These were all important 18th century scientists. And of course, that remarkable discussion of smallpox, which I'm not going to read with you, but you have at the beginning of the text. It goes on for 10 pages. So here we have the first description in Hebrew literature of Edward Jenner, and the whole fear that by vaccinating we are putting in germs into our body and so on. But what is very heroic and dramatic about this is he mentions his friend, the rabbi of Krakow, that takes 1,000 Jews and inoculates them. Now, many Christian clergy were extremely suspicious of the notion. It was transforming their notion of medicine. The idea of sticking in, to create antibodies to stick in this pox germ. But nevertheless, at least this remarkable source describes how Jews had no fear whatsoever, and they stepped forward and inoculated their kids. And he describes this in great detail, and so it's a really remarkable text. In addition to these scientific sources, there are also some awareness of the philosophy of his day. Again, an autodidact sitting in Vilna and Krakow. We're not speaking here about someone sitting in London or Berlin or somewhere else. He mentions Mendelssohn, he mentions Spinoza, he mentions Leibniz and Wolff. But his hero, believe it or not, is Immanuel Kant. Why Kant? Because Kant wrote a very important book in which he challenged the notion of metaphysical knowledge, arguing for the limits that all we can know is within our natural world, and anything beyond that, which he called the antinomies, like the question of creation of God, or like the question of God's providence and so on, are questions that we can never solve and therefore should never be the province of philosophy. This was a watershed in the history of Western thought. And Kant, as David Ellenson and many others have shown, has an enormous impact upon Western Jewish thought and Eastern Jewish thought as well. So the idea of this Eastern European Jew quoting Kant, how did he get to Kant? He did not read Kant in the original. He read him in a sikkum of the Jewish Berlin philosopher Shlomo Maimon. I don't know if you've come across that man, but he's probably one of the most original Jewish philosophers of the modern era, writing not only a discussion of Kant, but a critique of Kant. a very deep thinker. Much has been written about him. In fact, to connect him to our own teachers, Shmuel Atlas wrote an entire work on Maimon, in which he describes his philosophy within the context of modern philosophical thinking. So Maimon has a 2-page description of Kant, and basically Hurwitz read that in Hebrew and took it and incorporated it. He says, wow, that's what I need. Now I can make the argument. Nature is good, philosophy is bad, and he also has a long critique of the notion from Maimonides on of all of these philosophers introducing Aristotle and Plato into Judaism. That's not Judaism. Judaism, that's essentially fraudulent. It's a forgery. Take it out. The Yevanim are over here, the Jews are over here. Let's not mix the two. And not only that, so the pièce de résistance is Kant. Now Kant comes along. I can quote the latest philosopher of our time, and I can say, nature is important. That's what we should be doing as philosophers, but not beyond nature. Then we can do our Kabbalah. So that's why Kabbalah and his philosophy, his natural philosophy, can go together, can be wedded together in this creative way. So Kant comes to reinforce this Eastern European Jew. One final point about the content of the book, and I'm on to part 3. And that is, again, the book-selling aspect. That is a great interest of me. You know, at the University of Pennsylvania, but not at many universities, there is a subfield of cultural history called the history of the book, the history of reading. The history of the book as a material text. In other words, these guys look at table of contents, they look at spaces on a page, they look at how a book was printed. They argue that there's never one author, there are hundreds of authors. There's the author, the publisher, the printer, the one who sells the book, and so on. In other words, the history of the printed book is a subfield of cultural history this day, which has transformed the way we look at the history of culture in general, not only Western culture, but elsewhere. And as I indicated very quickly in my last lecture, so much has gone on within the history of the Jewish book, the printing of the Jewish book, and its transformation of Jewish culture. And I summarize some of that in the 3rd chapter of my early modern Jewry book, which I mentioned to you before. But clearly here is a product of that world with specific instructions. I want the book published in certain letters. I want certain folios to be this wide. I don't want people to copy the book. I don't want people to read out of turn, but to read the whole book. In other words, I showed this to one of the great scholars of the history of the book, Roger Chartier, at the University of Pennsylvania. He had never seen instructions like this, which are also presented in rabbinic language. You know, it really makes it quite interesting. A specific awareness of the power of print and how to control that power for his own use. Okay, so that's something about the book itself. So now we turn to the 3rd part. And I must tell you, as I said, all history is autobiographical. This is what pulled me to this book. I needed this voice for our day and age, for our Jewish world. And I hope you will feel that same feeling here. The penultimate chapter, before he gets in the room where he starts ascending his soul, so to speak, there's a chapter called Habrit Re'im, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. What this is doing in a science book, I mean, that's a great question. I kind of, when someone asked me a question last time, I kind of alluded to the answer, that loving animals and birds might also lead to loving other human beings. Be that as it may, Pinhas Hurwitz devotes a chapter of some 50 pages to exploring the meaning of Habrit Re'im. Now, Habrit Re'im, of course, has enormous parshanut. I mean, you can go study it from rabbinic time on. In most cases, as Ernst Simon and Moshe Greenberg and others who have studied this and have actually published articles on this, in almost every case, Re'ah means Jew. Sometimes Ger, but definitely always Jew. This is not necessarily universalism. It may have been in the original biblical text. I'm not a biblical scholar. But clearly, as the rabbis understood this text, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha meant primarily loving other Jews. The question is, who is Re'ah? It is not necessarily B'nai Adam. This begins to change, of course, in the Middle Ages. The whole history of Jewish-Christian attitudes towards the other is a very complicated process. If you want references in my book, I'll give you, a ton of bibliography to see that one of the most important expositions of this, of tracing this idea is found in Jacob Katz's great work, Exclusiveness to Tolerance. There's a wonderful chapter there where he describes in the 13th century Menachem HaMeiri, the author of a commentary on the Talmud called Boca, who is the first to argue that the Goyim of our day are not the Goyim of antiquity, and therefore, the whole notion of what is a Goy, and separating Christianity and Islam from, in other words, monotheists are a different category. But still, we have a long way to go from the 13th century on into the 16th and 17th, 18th century in terms of seeing the Goy as a, not simply Mipnei Darkei Shalom, we should be good to the non-Jew, but actually relating to him, treating him, respecting his dignity, and so on. This takes a long period of time. When we get to Mendelssohn, finally, we have, of course, tolerating the Goy. But what we are speaking about here, I would argue, is quite different. It's loving the Goy that he is going to argue for in this book. Not just respecting him, not just sitting with him, but loving the Goy. And he goes on, page after page, to argue about the human dignity of everyone, and the need to love each other. So it's almost like we would argue, a Christian ideal of loving, in the sense that Jesus described loving. But of course, he's not referring to Christianity here. He's referring to Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Now, he himself tells us, I don't have many sources that make this argument. So therefore, I'm going to embellish this. And he tries here and there. He finds even in Chaim Vital a line where it says, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and Vital says, afilu Goy. But afilu Goy is already an indication that the Goy is second class. It's not first class. Hurwitz wants to go a step farther. So all of a sudden, in the middle of this text, Eastern European Kabbalist sitting there working on science, he's talking about loving Goyim. Wow, a voice for our time, against the xenophobia. He's mad about the Spartan and Ashkenazim don't get along with each other when he comes to Amsterdam. What's going on here? Jews, they don't even get along with each other. But they don't care about other human beings and so on. And the question is, where does he get this from? And I only can give you one hint. So here I want to show you one little text, which is translated to English. All right, there it is. So this is a paragraph right at the beginning of this long chapter. You can read it yourself. Or can you see it? Is it okay? Is it big enough? What?
If you click on slideshow, it will.
What do I do? I don't know how to do this.
It should be down at the bottom. See the X in the bottom right-hand corner? If you click on that, it should be.
All right, and you have the pictures also. The pictures are related to this. No, you didn't have the pictures. I'll give you the pictures in a second. So anyway, here's the story. It is about a prince named Leopold of Brunswick. It's the only non-Jewish source in the whole chapter. He calls him a Menschenfreund. And essentially it's a story about how there was a flood in the river of Oder. And this dumb prince gets into a boat to try to save all of his people that are being dying from the flood. And he of course, loses his own life in the process. He became, now you would think this is a crazy story, so where does he get this from and so on? The story is really, at the end of the 18th century, a universal story. This Leopold of Brunswick was written about by German poets like Schiller and Goethe and Lessing. And now Lessing, you will see, is a key for me for something even larger. We have several other Jewish references to this prince. even a hesped written by the rabbi of Frankfurt de Oder, in which he said, he describes this boy going up to heaven for all the wonderful things. He was an example of humanity. Interesting that in this Jewish Kabbalistic text, the prince of humanity becomes a non-Jewish prince and is extolled in monuments, in art. So let me show you the art. How do I do this? Here we go. Yeah, there it is. So this is art. This is all prince. This is all from this period. There are tons of material written about this prince, and these are very famous artists. And they're all in different countries. So we have poetry, we have prose, we have monuments, we have a full sense. This becomes the image of what a good human being is about, an altruistic human being. This is picked up in this Hebrew text, and it appears before us in a remarkable way. Now, of course, those of you that know this period will think more in terms of Germany, and will come back to Lessing. Because Lessing, of course, was the great friend of Moses Mendelssohn, and Lessing wrote this wonderful play called Nathan the Wise, which describes in a play for the first time a good, decent Jew, and prescribes this brotherhood between Jew and Christian. And the larger background of this, and one of my weird interests I know, is Freemasonry. Anybody know anything about Masons? Any of you belong to Masonic lodges? When I gave a lecture on Freemasonry in England, the Cecil Roth Memorial Lecture in London, I asked the people to stand up who were Freemasons, and almost the whole audience of Jews stood up. It's a big deal. So some of you put your hands up that you're Freemasons. Wow. All right, so if you know anything about the history of Freemasonry, Jacob Katz wrote a whole book about Freemasons and Jews. The Freemasons were these brotherhoods that emerged in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and they reached their crescendo in this period of time. There were lodges of human beings that got together to share a kind of liturgy, a infatuation with the temple and with the regalia of the temple, and the high priest. They created miniature Beit HaMikdash so that he could celebrate every detail of the priestly ritual. And what was remarkable about Freemasonry was, it was, as Jacob Katz calls it, a semi-neutral space prior to Jewish emancipation that accepted Jews. Jews were accepted into Masonic lodges. In other words, Jews and Christians could share something together. The Masons were open. They were sensitive to Jewish symbols, of course, but beyond that, they were indeed open in a spirit of tolerance. When I wrote my English book, I spent some time in the Masonic Lodge in London. It's an unbelievable place. And I found there lodges just for Jews. They even had kosher food in some of these Masonic lodges. And indeed, all of the Jewish thinkers in the 18th century in England were connected to Masonic lodges. In Germany as well during this period of time. Now, early on, of course, by the 19th century, with the rise of anti-Semitism, these lodges become more and more exclusive and kick out the Jews. That will eventually happen. But at this moment, this is the spirit of Lessing, of toleration. Lessing wrote a book called The Masonic Dialogues. He was a Mason himself. And clearly his relationship with Mendelssohn came out of that love of humanity which the Freemasons had given. Now, I'm not arguing that Hurwitz was a Freemason, I don't know. But this paragraph is there, and these pictures describe the context for understanding that paragraph. In other words, here is an Eastern European Jew who comes to Berlin, and then goes on to Amsterdam, and then travels to London and so on, and is educating himself, and is aware of human beings at large, and decides to choose this particular notion and to describe it so forcefully to his Orthodox Jews, basically. Now let me tell you, all of these drashot, all of you love to throw out the idea that the essential notion of Judaism is tikkun olam. I was going on about this with Eric Yaffe. Believe it or not, tikkun olam to a lot of Jews is not the central feature of Judaism. It is our Judaism, but it's not their Judaism. And clearly, without that fusion of liberalism and Judaism in the 19th century, we wouldn't have the moral conscience that we have and the way we see our world and our own perspective. I mean, don't take it for granted. Tikkun, yes, tikkun is a Lorianic concept, right? But tikkun is not the same thing as tikkun olam.
I'm sure many of you in your sermons tried to combine the two. Lurie was talking about tikkun olam. No. He's not talking about the moral transformation of the world, going into the ghettos and transforming the world. He's speaking about a mystical process that has very little to do with tikkun olam. What I'm saying is that this is a 19th century text which permeates from Eastern Europe, and it is related to science. So here's a traveler who goes between East and West, but he is sensitized to the notion that Jews have to care about non-Jews, and they have to even love them. And this is not, and what is most remarkable about this text is the following, that this is a mystical journey, that it is the precondition of having the Ruach HaKodesh. You can't reach God without loving human beings. So that's why I needed this text for myself. I don't know if you need it, but I need it. I needed to hear that voice as it spoke to me within the context of the 21st century. And one final thought in this third part of it, and I go to the last part, and that is, if one looks, a lot of work on modern Jewish thought has been done on the West, primarily Germany. From Mendelssohn to Buber, Rosenzweig, that was the course that Gene Borowitz taught, and I guess an equivalent course in Cincinnati and so on. And that is very important. I still teach that material as well in my courses. But recent scholarship of the past 20 or 30 years, it actually started before the Shoah, but it has begun again and so on, is a new interest in Eastern European Jewish thought. And to discover among a whole group of Eastern European thinkers a streak of tolerance and interest in the Zulat. Most recently, to give you one example, a text was published that had been lost by Nachman of Breslov, the great Hasidic Rebbe. We, of course, knew a great deal about him through Arthur Green's wonderful biography. But this was discovered afterwards, and this scroll talks about his love of humanity. So this comes right from the heart of a Hasidic world. So there is indeed a universal tolerant aspect to Eastern European Jewish thought that maybe we have neglected, and we need to look at more clearly. And it emerges within the context of Vilna, not Berlin or not London or Paris. And that perhaps can be linked up to the story of Pinhas Hurwitz as well. So finally I come to the fourth part. I do want to leave time for questions. We have until 1:15, I think. So I need about 10-15 more minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. As I said, this was not a marginal book. I've made my career on reading authors that no one else reads, and therefore what I say about them is always original. But in this case, this is a book that had not been treated seriously in scholarship, but had been read by lots and lots of Jews. So we've had 40 editions, 3 Yiddish, 5 Ladino. I should tell you, and it's just, is Rifat here? I don't know if Rifat is here this morning. Oh, there you are. His Jews are really cool people. When I was listening to his nusach, I was thinking of this. Very early in the 19th century, a work appears in Ladino called Torat Adam. They took only the chapter on Ahavat Re'im. They said, the hell with the rest of it. We have to make this chapter prominent. And they wrote and they published it in Ladino. They understood its importance. Now, many Orthodox readers read this text and ignored it, They didn't put it in Herem. They could have, but they ignored it. They talked about other things in the book. But nevertheless, it remains. They read it. It was there. So whatever you want to make of it in terms of its impact, it is there. Now, of course, the Maskilim picked it up immediately and said, wow, this is great stuff. We love him. And so is Pinhas Hurwitz a Maskil, or is he a Haredi Jew? He's both. You really can't classify him here. He's very traditional. He talks about Kabbalah and about mystical ascent and all of that at the same time. He has an appeal to all kinds of people. So the most remarkable thing is that the first group of people that loved this book were the Maskilim, both in Western and Eastern Europe. But then we have a whole group of Hasidic authors. Nachman of Breslov, every time he mentions Sefer HaTeva, he is referring to Sefer Habrit. And here, I want to show you, I can give you, and then the Sephardic authors. For the Sephardic authors, there's a whole series of Sephardic rabbis from the 18th century on that love this book. They were also interested in Kabbalah and science and so on. So we have Sephardim, and then we have Yiddish writers, then we have Hebrew writers, Agnon, Bialik, Isaac Bashevet Singer said this was his favorite book of his mother. She loved to read the stories about science in this book and so on. It has an extraordinary history, and I try to trace that history with over 100 references to books and authors writing and using this book for their own purposes. Now, I have here just a couple of examples. I'm going to do this very quickly, but I think you'll enjoy this. So, here's one of the most extraordinary, just to show you how, when we simplify Jewish history into categories, black and white, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, we get too confused here. Some of you know who the great luminary of Pressburg, Hungary was in the 19th century, known as Moses Sefer, Raton Sefer, or Hossam Sefer, as Atlas would say. You've heard of Raton Sefer. Raton Sefer is known for a lot of things, but everybody quotes only one line of his work. To show, and in fact, Ellenson and others have brought out, that orthodoxy is a construction of modernity, just like reform is a construction of modernity. So the line attributed to the Raton Sefer is, Kol Chadash Min HaTorah Asur. That's pretty conservative, right? Even our conservative Republicans would, I don't know if they would say that line. Kol Chadash Min HaTorah Asur, everything new is forbidden. Okay? That sort of places us in a certain category. However, here is the testimony of Solomon Sefer, the grandson of the Raton Sefer. It is Chut HaMeshulash, I'm translating, a collection of biographies of famous members of the Sefer family. He writes, he, Moshe Sefer, my grandfather, was an expert in the science of measurements, algebra, and the calendar. In this he was quite efficient and able. He was also proficient in astronomy and physics and began to compose a special book on these sciences so that it would be handy to his students to study from it without having to consult Gentile authorities. But when the Sefer Habrit was published, he examined it from beginning to end and declared that anyone who desires to satisfy himself in various sciences should acquire it. For I and you are indebted to the author, since I was able to acquire much valuable time and not having to write a book like this for myself. So, that's Raton Sefer. Writing a Sefer Habrit. That's the most arch conservative, anti-modern thinker you could write. So, again, to underscore my point, that philosophy is heresy, but science and nature is kosher, and clearly given the kosher seal by Raton Sefer himself. Let me just show you two more texts and then I'll stop. This is from the first Yiddish edition of Sefer Habrit, Warsaw, 1898, translated by Yosef Meir ben Shmuel Yitzchak Yavitz. So here is a translation. I didn't make the translation, but one of my friends who does good Yiddish translated it for me. All the sciences of the world. This is his advertisement for the book. The heaven, the earth, the oceans, including all living creatures, are clearly explained. Above all, the precious divine accomplishments with which man is crowned. The famous work was written in holiness and purity in the holy tongue by the pious scholar and Rabbi Pinhas of Vilna, of blessed memory. The present work shines augustly in the Jewish skies like the sun. As the work was printed the first time anonymously, the rabbinic sages believed that the great Gaon of Vilna had composed it. And to make it easier on the eyes of those who don't understand the holy tongue, this work has now been translated into simple jargon, and that is Yiddish, by the well-known translator Yosef Meir Yavitz, the translator of the Mishnayos, the Midrashim, the Chok Yaakov, and the Ein Yaakov. Reprinting is strictly forbidden. Now, but notice, this has become now a Sefer Kodesh. It's with the Mishnayos and the Midrashim and so on. You put this on your shelf. It has the approval of all the great rabbis, and clearly, therefore, it extols the majesty of God. Now, the last example is really quite a remarkable one, and maybe a little bit out of character with the rest. I want to call it, you'll forgive it the way I'm ending this way, it's not on a high note, but a Sefer Habrit in the toilet. And you'll see in a second what I mean there. Some of you may recall that in the 1930s, the YIVO organized essay contests for Eastern European Jews. This was just a couple of years before the Shoah. And we have in YIVO in New York the entire repository of these essays over the course of several years. And they have been written up in a book published by Yale University Press. I forgot, the title is called Awakening Lives, Autobiographies of Jewish Youth in Poland Before the Holocaust. edited by Jeffrey Chandler, 2002. This is from page 119. One of my colleagues found this text and sent it to me right away. And here's how it goes. A young boy who calls himself Chenech, writing in Yiddish in 1934, where he was a student at the Hurwitz Yeshiva in Raton. I obtained a copy of the Sefer Habrit and virtually committed it to memory, reading it in the bathroom for fear of being caught and confronted with a whole new series of accusations. The Sefer Habrit gave me a sound foundation in anatomy, physics, geography, and the like. I had a weakness, however, for showing off my scientific learning to my friends without telling them about this source. This led to my becoming known as a person of wide-ranging knowledge, and I was sought after by those who were drawn to the Haskalah. So notice, I mean, typically yeshiva bocher, you know, what do you do with a scientific text? You memorize it, like you memorize the Mishnah, you know, or the Gemara and so on. So he memorized it. So he was a walking encyclopedia of 18th century science, even though this was 1934. In any case, this legacy goes on and on and on. There's a story, what's the famous yeshiva outside of Tel Aviv? Help me? No, the Lodge, is it the Lodge? It's a very famous rabbi who died a number of years ago. I can't remember the name of the yeshiva. Oh, I'm missing it.
Here?
No, not near. Anyway, when I was 17 on the intermediate year course, I went in to this yeshiva. And I remember asking a student, yeah, the Pontovich yeshiva, thank you. So I go into the Pontovich yeshiva and I said, but don't you want to go to university and study? He said, and then he turns to the Gemara and he says, I call Bo, everything's here, you don't need any more. The head of the Pontovich yeshiva is a very famous rabbi whose name also escapes me, I don't have it in front of me. And he writes that he not only loved Sefer Habrit, but he kept it at his desk. And one of his assistants trying to open it up, he says, don't take it away from me, because this book will stay here until the redemption comes, until the Mashiach comes. Now, why do you think this was a messianic text? I'm not sure. I certainly didn't read Ahavat Re'im, and it didn't, ring a bell for him. But clearly, every Jewish reader could find something else in this book which made it attractive to him, whether it was the science, whether it was the moral, the musar, whether it was the ascent of the soul. And clearly, therefore, it became a bestseller for all kinds of Jewish readers. As I said, there are several new modern versions. If you go to Bnei Brak, or you go to Mea Sha'arim, or if you go to Brooklyn, you can buy the book very easily in a modern edition. And you can see that it is still being read and discussed by traditional Jews. You could say that, it's sort of kind of retrograde, it's really passé by now, but it gives you an indication that there were ways in which even traditional Jews could enter the modern world and participate in that world in some sense, and how they could sort of reconcile their own traditionalism with a sense of the newness of the modern world and find a way in which they could work together and collaborate. The last thing I want to say is this. The thinkers that I treat from the Middle Ages up until Pinhas Hurwitz clearly had a vision of nature and science, which was humanistic at the core, but was also about divine. It was filled with spirituality. It was filled with an appreciation of humanity. It was filled with the love of God. If we turn to our 20th century and 21st century, it's not always so clear that science and that remarkable fusion of religion and science was able to hold together. There are arguments that science unleashed created the Holocaust, or created the kind of context in which the Holocaust could take place. A mechanical universe where everything is driven by machines and by technology and by internet and et cetera, and what it can do if it's not used purposefully. My argument here, and I'm not asking for a return to this world whatsoever, but one of the most remarkable aspects of this study of the history of Jewish thought on science is how Jewish this material is. and how it is saturated with religiosity, with the feeling of God, how this comes out of a really religious frame of mind. It is not simply the history of science that I've been studying here. It is the history of Jewish thought, of expanding Jewish thought, of going in new directions, but also in finding in all of those corners simanei habriut, to use the language already of Nachmanides. Those simanim, in other words, nature reveals to us something about the divine world that we live in. So ultimately, therefore, it seemed appropriate for me to speak about science to distinguished rabbis like yourselves. That indeed, this is part of the arsenal of Jewish thought, of Jewish culture, that we try to preserve and pass down in new ways. And clearly, that fusion between religiosity and science is an ideal that I think is worth preserving in some sense. In other words, allow science to grow, but allow it to grow in a moral and spiritual way. And ultimately, these two parts need to be linked together. Clearly, whatever Hurwitz was, and he's not our kind of guy, but nevertheless, he saw the possibilities of what nature could reveal about the deepest concerns of our life. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have, I see 10 minutes for questions. So that one went up first. Yes, stand up. Do you want to take this?
No, I don't think so.
All right, anybody want to walk around with this, or?
I'll take it.
All right.
And the question I have is, was Hurwitz able to achieve this because of his understanding of the integrated process of the four worlds in Kabbalah? And if so, was he able to state it that way?
Was he able to?
Did he state it in those words that obviously from Atibu to Asiya, they're all integrated with each other,
Yeah.
and they're all one.
Right.
Like May Paul Whitman,
Right.
If the grass is no less than the journey work of the stars.
Good, good. Yeah, no, it is there in one form or another. Of course, the idea of the integration of the world also parallels itself in Neoplatonism. In other words, there's, in the history of Kabbalah, Neoplatonic thought is very connected to early Kabbalah, and there are extraordinary parallels here between the two. What is interesting about his approach to Kabbalah is that most of the Kabbalistic thinkers that he draws from are from Italy. And that is where, first of all, Italy is the first to receive Lurianic Kabbalah, but before that, Italy is very special in the history of Kabbalah in its integration with other ancient philosophies of Western Europe, particularly Neoplatonism. So what happens in Italy is that Kabbalah becomes more philosophical. It becomes more deeply integrated with the larger world. But clearly, the four worlds is a notion which has a long history, both in Jewish and in non-Jewish thought, and it helps to explain. Sure, the physical world is an echo of what's going on above, and that's a very useful category. Where?
He's got the mic.
Okay, go.
I was absolutely fascinated. My reaction was I would love to see you give a lecture of this nature before a convention of secular Jews.
Well, not only I've done that, of course, one of the biggest kicks of giving lectures was a series of talks I gave on Judaism and science at the Yale Medical School before they were all Jewish doctors. And that was really cool. I mean, I was a little nervous because I didn't know as much as them about medicine, but I've done that before, and secular, but religious Jews too. We should know that our religious Jews didn't turn away from this material. That's what I'm trying to underscore throughout. And they found creative ways to integrate it. Maybe not satisfactory to ourselves, but nevertheless, just this shows you again, look at those pictures, look at the story I just told you about. This doesn't come from Abraham Geiger Reform Judaism. I mean, we like to take claim for it all. But this guy somehow was exposed to a certain morality and ethics and appreciation of the other, which came from traditional Jewish thought. And that makes it all the more interesting. We need Reform Judaism for all the others that have to understand the universality of Judaism, but he somehow got it. And that sort of gives me hope that traditional Judaism, with all of the Harediyut of this day and so on, and all of its xenophobia and closedness and so on, that there are potentials in that kind of thinking for a more universal, secular, and greater appreciation of other Jews and other human beings.
I understand why someone would read Sefer Habrit for its moral teachings, but how relevant are these scientific data?
You're too much of a... you've given up your Ottoman roots and you're a modern American rabbi. I'm sorry. But yeah, I mean, but this comes from the Ruach HaKodesh, you know? I mean, it has the patina of orthodoxy in it. Of course it's outdated and it's ridiculous. Pinhas Hurwitz is still playing around with the idea of Copernicus. He's kind of convinced that Copernicus is right. But what's really interesting is that he wants to sort of take a take-who on this. He's not sure Copernicus, you know, because then what do we do with Joshua and the sun standing still and all of that and so on. But he quotes a letter from Jacob Hart, his friend in England, who says, "You're an idiot. We all accept Copernicus by now. Let's move on. We got other more important things to do." So at least he acknowledges the fact that he's stupid about this. It's outdated, it's irrelevant. I think for us the message of this book is not its substance, but the process that's going on here. And that, you know, the problem, of course, what we're describing in this book is an open orthodoxy, which then becomes closed by the middle of the 19th century, and it sort of arrests itself in terms of its exposure to modern science and so on. Now, that's not totally true, because there are plenty of Jewish thinkers that are more aware of modern science. But clearly, Pinhas, and now I'll give you another example. Another area I didn't talk about was the impact of Sefer Habrit in Shut literature, in the literature of Sheilot U'Tshuvot, rabbinical responsa. They see him as an authority on nature, and therefore they quote him to prove a halacha. So again, I mean, that's why he's accepted. It's not a reason for us to accept him in that way, but I think we can appreciate the process. But again, the chapter that interests us, or at least me the most, is Ahavat Re'im, and that chapter, except for the more rational type, seems to be ignored. But nevertheless, ignored is an interesting word here, because they still had to read it, and they never censored it. And of course, your Ottoman Jews loved it. I mean, they really, you know, like to hang around with Muslims and drink with them, and you know, there's a big Yaron Ben-Naya writes about homosexuality in 18th century Jewish circles, and they were doing everything that everybody else was doing. So Ahavat Ha'adam is a very important part of this process. But they were unusual because others were not doing this. But nevertheless, the book remains a classic bestseller within the Orthodox Jewish world, and the Pontovich Yeshiva can also prove it. That, to me, is quite extraordinary. Others, yes?
David, we spoke briefly that the works you spoke about on Friday reflected a larger dissociation of religion and science that's going on in the history of science in general. How does Hurwitz's work reflect a reintegration of religion and science at the time that he's writing? Or does it not?
No, I mean, it does. I mean, it seems to me, unless I missed some nuance in your question. I mean, what I was talking about was exactly this, that he was able, from a Kabbalistic perspective, to find an elevated place within a commentary on Chaim Vital for explaining the importance of scientific knowledge. I mean, again, I didn't give you an inventory of what these books are about. He starts with astronomy, and then he moves down into the natural world, describing the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and so on. He has chapters on weather, on earthquakes, on all kinds of things. And then finally he gets to talking about the human being and the human body. In other words, someone reading this book has a kind of very preliminary understanding of the world as it's constructed from the perspective of authors writing in the 18th century. But the rest of the book is about Musar, it's about God, it's about God ascending to God, and so on. And as he argues over and over again, these are not two separate books, they are one book. This is a journey which begins with nature and ends with Ruach HaKodesh. So in that sense, it is a reintegration of what had gone on previously from, Nachmanides through the Renaissance period, a whole series of authors trying to work out this relationship between Kabbalah and science. Right up until, the book by Danny Matt called The Big Bang Theory, where he talks about, so Danny Matt has been spending his whole life with a very rich honorarium. I'm a little jealous, but no, not really. I couldn't do what he does. He sits and he translates the Zohar for Stanford University Press. That's all he does for like 30 years. Pritzker, they're the ones that supporting him. So he wrote a book called The Big Bang, in which he argues that the Lurianic Kabbalah, the notion of Shvirat HaKelim, is parallel to the idea of Big Bang in terms of understanding the origins of the universe. So here again, he's sort of, trying to integrate these elements as one. I don't know, how convincing that is, but it's interesting. Anyway, I hope I answered your question. Last question.
What was the scientific context for Ahavat Re'im? And when he just started talking about Ahavat Re'im, did he try to relate it to something in the Bible or some religious context? It's scientific, I don't mean that you relate it to some scientific concept.
No, that's the problem. It is a essay that stands on its own. He says, I don't have many Jewish texts. He does mention Cicero, the skeptics, and he obviously had confronted some classical text, but he only mentions that in passing. He says, well, all I have to go on is Leviticus.
What about what's the point? How does science connect with?
Well, that's the question, and he doesn't tell us explicitly. He goes on and he formulates, so he begins first by talking about the general notion of how in society people need to love each other to survive. And then he goes on to talk about Jews and Christians. And then he talks about, then he breaks it into various parts. Man and wife, man and human beings, and parents and children, brothers and brothers, all different categories. And then he even has a section on, book dealers should not steal books from others. He's every little sin, of humanity is mentioned within this chapter and so on. But how does it link up to science? And here I can only, formulate an hypothesis, which I threw out to you earlier, which is people who are interested in nature, particularly the majesty of nature, particularly the divine aspects of nature, simanei habriut, abriot, or however you want to put it, they also, to move to the moral plane is very easy. In other words, if you love animals, why not love? He describes the way animals take care of themselves and so on. If you love animals and if you appreciate, the ecology of the universe, then you need to appreciate human society and to keep it intact and harmonious in the best way. So I think the lesson is never explicit, but I think implicitly he's arguing that indeed human morality and knowledge of the natural world and science are linked together. That's the only explanation I can offer you.
Thank you, David.